Welcome to The Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. First up in this episode, Tanbir Grover joins me for the first of a two-part interview reflecting on his 12 years at the forefront of digital retail and e-commerce in Canada, working for brands including Sears Canada, Hudson's Bay, and Lowe's Canada. We talk corporate culture, the history of Canadian e-commerce, and the state of online retail today, and how we got here from there, and where we're going next. Next, April Savril joins me to kick off the new retail year, sharing her incredible experience on the front lines of retail for 25 years, from Starbucks to Apple to David's Tea. April talks about what retailers should be thinking about in terms of their associates, how your willingness to recommend scores need to encompass employee satisfaction, the recipe for success for retailers, and driving in-store conversion through training and development, plus fills us in on her new venture, retailu.ca. But first, let's jump into part one of my interview with Tanbir Grover. Tanbir, welcome to The Voice of Retail. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Michael. Thank you for having me today.
Well, it's such a treat to have the opportunity to sit and chat. You and I have known each other many, many years.
Many years.
But for the benefit of the listeners at home, tell me about tell us about your professional and your personal journey and a bit about yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in retail for 12 years, almost exclusively all in the digital space and e-com. Started off at Sears, where I kind of learned the e-commerce trade. This was back when websites were still in its infancy, and
Sears was the king, man.
Sears was the best place to be at that time because can you imagine being 30-something, being thrown into a digital world, and a lot of people around you were like, "This is just a fad. Like, don't jump into this thing. It's a fad.
It's never going to be anything.
It's never going to be anything. It's never going to replace bricks and mortar. It's never going to change anything." Lo and behold, 12 years later, it's nothing in my mind, and it continues to be growth and a lot of fun, a lot of positive energy, and a big case of disruption for retail. Yeah. So Sears was a good learning ground. Took that to the Bay, as you're familiar with. Yeah. For round two of the Bay's e-commerce launch in 2010. Yeah. So helped the team launch their business digitally, and it's always fun to see the 10-year celebration of the one-day sales of the Bay and kind of remember back in the day. Oh yeah, I was part of that on day one when that happened.
Fantastic.
And
that's where your career and my career intersect a little bit.
That's where
version 1 and version 1.0.
That's where I saw your old names on the shared drives of HBC. So for sure there. And then I got the call from Lowe's back in 2012, and the same question was asked: "Is can you help us launch our e-commerce business in Canada?" And I thought that would be a great opportunity. To be a part of that story, one that I could always have and cherish and tell my kids like I was the guy who helped start that and do that. So Lowe's has been an incredible journey. Been there for 7.5 years. Continue to work with some great people, great teams. And when we bought Rona, took over responsibility of Rona.ca, RenoDepot.com, and Ace Hardware in Canada. All growing at different sort of rates and things. So it provides a lot of differences in sort of understanding how to manage. But again, everything in digital is fast, it's furious, and it's all full of learnings, which I love.
The Lowe's experience must have been so interesting because you went from a core small team launching Lowe's in Canada to a big, diverse team with various levels of progression and .com when you think of Rona and you're kind of like, okay, let's attach ourselves to this bigger, broader team and let's figure out where to start.
Yeah, right? In some ways we had that. I mean, we had the autonomy of being Lowe's.ca, even though we had the sister company or the big brother called Lowe's.com, right? You're talking about the billion-dollar business in terms of what it does. And, having the autonomy in Canada to run it was kind of a blessing in some ways. Like, you got to try some things, you got to fail at some things really quickly and kind of learn how you would want to do it. But what I loved the most was obviously the smaller team, because you were nimble as a team and you were quick as a team and everything kind of got going. And then when we acquired Rona, the team actually, it increased for sure, but the culture and the discipline of being nimble was still inherent in both of those teams. And I think the Rona team felt more choked at times because they had the idea of what they wanted to do. They just weren't given the funding and the support. And I think with Lowe's, with Sylvain's leadership around as well at that time was, we've created this really awesome model for Lowe's and Lowe's.ca. Why can't we take that same playbook and deploy it to Rona and Reno? And I think, when we made the acquisition, and one of the things I'm most proud of was there's two things he said always was, let's get appliances going in the Rona businesses and let's get e-commerce going in the Rona businesses. And those two strategic pillars, for me, I was part of one of them. And launching that was a blast because I got to take some of that, even though it was a bigger team, inherently we treated it like a small family of let's go disrupt the Canadian e-commerce business.
Right on. With a great leader like Sylvain Prudhomme, who I know and appreciate as well. So it's great.
He was such a big supporter of mine, and with his retirement, it's been a big loss for me just because I've lost. I don't think I've lost a friend. I've gained a friend more on the personal side.
Sure. But
to lose his professional guidance and support at times, that's tough always. But it's part of the retail.
Yeah, it is.
The retail world, right?
It is what it is.
You and I have both experienced it and seen it in our time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. And just on a side note, it's interesting how culture matters so much in these large purchases, right? So we've seen. I talked about it on the stage with. Walter Robb from Whole Foods. Amazon and Whole Foods. You pretty much couldn't find two more different cultures.
Yeah.
And you see it. It's interesting. Again, you see LMVH buying Tiffany's today.
Yeah.
So all luxury, but let's see how the culture and I think. What you're saying is you had these pockets of culture that were very much aligned.
Yeah.
In key ways.
Yes and no. Like I think so. Before I remember a great conversation with a mentor who said to me, when I said to him, Lowe's is buying Rona, this is going to be a complex thing, or it's going to, it could be complex or it could be really easy. And he said to me, it'll be more complex than you think. And I kind of pushed back and said, why would it be complex? We both sell hammers and nails. We both sell
on the surface,
lumber,
right?
Lumber and building supplies. Like we're both home improvement guys, right? And his take to me was take a pause. Remember that you're talking about two different languages, two different geo centers. So Toronto, Boucherville, just differences in approach and thought. And to your point, it's the surface level is easy. It's when you get beyond the surface that you start realizing the nuances in culture that kind of either accelerate culture or decelerate culture in terms of what you can do. And I think for me, that was one of the biggest learnings that I had was, I went in with this, no problem. I can lead any team. It's, they'll kind of follow this process and adaptation. And what I came out of it was, one is you need to be authentic with who you are, because if you start changing, then God knows what they're going to see.
Lost.
You're lost anyway.
Lost, right? Yeah.
But I think part two was, you need to actively listen. You need to understand where they're coming from and their perspective and why they do certain things. And that was one of the greatest appreciations I had for Rona was, it wasn't like they wanted to not sell stuff or not do stuff. Is they wanted to, but they had limitations in their network. They had a wholesale model and they had a retail model. And trying to figure out how you match those two is very difficult at times.
So let's talk about, we've talked about culture. Let's talk about your observations in the past.
Yeah.
Not in the past, let me reframe that. Your observations over the course of the development of e-commerce in Canada. So many people ask me, how and why did e-commerce develop differently? I've got my own experiences and theories. What's your experience about Canadian e-commerce and its state of, its state today?
It's, I actually think today it's much better than what it used to be. We talk about Sears as being the king of e-commerce back in 2007.
Well, right? and we shared this observation. When we were at HBC, our goal was just to take a nick out of Sears.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
They had it all, right? They had
we had the
catalog business. They knew how to buy eaches. They had they had warehouses.
The supply chain model was built out to do all this activity, and we had the network to kind of go through with the dealers and the catalog agents out there.
Licensees, and you had pickup points and drop-off points. And,
it was so this is why I think my Sears experience was so interesting, was I got to learn at an established e-commerce shop that really leveraged the catalog business, right? So it took the phone business and the catalog business and it just digitized it. And I think at that time, when you think about what the retail landscape looked like, it was that, though. It was, people were not sure how to lean in yet on the e-commerce front because they weren't sure what it was going to stay. And if you look back at Sears, Sears was on the Amazon platform of retail.
That's right.
Okay. Same with Target. Target was one of the customers. Toys R Us was, because I think they moved.
Such unusual decisions, right?
If you think about that, making that decision today, no retailer would ever make that decision today.
Yeah.
But in 2007, it was viewed as a compliment. And you know what? Let's get on a stabilized platform that has growth and it has all these features and benefits that will allow for us to actually sell online.
On the surface, not a crazy thing to think about, right?
When you look back at that point in time, I probably would have said it's a very valid decision because Amazon was not really a threat to anybody at that time. Sure. It was still very in its infancy of its own business model of what it was trying to be in. It could have taken the angle of we want to be a retailer, or it could have taken the angle of we want to be an IT shop and a service provider. who knew it was going to do both? Time, right? And kind of continue to expand that into different verticals and different areas. But I think to that credit, I feel like e-commerce was at its infancy because we didn't know what to lean into at that point in time. Mm-hmm. I then look back in 2010 when I joined the Bay, and I feel like now the e-commerce stuff was starting to happen. Like you had the Bay was launching. Loblaws Digital was talking about starting up its own business in 2010 and saying we got to get digitized. And really, Joe Fresh was a big push into that. We got to get this going, and then we'll get groceries kind of going after that. So I feel like what ended up happening was a couple of things. One, I think costs started coming down. So you started seeing the early democratization of technology. Yeah. Now you look at it today with Shopify, and they've completely changed the name of that game.
Sure. And big sites running on Shopify Plus,
correct.
like Staples
is Shopify Plus's big customer.
Could you imagine that 15 years ago? I guess you could imagine it because
you could think about it,
that was
but
what Amazon was proposing.
Would you have done it in that sort of way though? Probably not. And it's going to be a remarkable journey to see how that kind of plays out, given the complexities of what it is in terms of how do we deliver, how do we split orders, how do we do multiple ship points, how do we do how do we add all of the complexity or what we call the secret sauce of our businesses out there.
And at significant scale. Already Staples already a significant player.
Significant play, right? And even what they're doing with Instacart now is fantastic with trying to get deliveries out in the same day or within a couple hours of that in major metros. So you think about that in 2010 with the Bay and sort of leaning in now, but I think a lot of that came also with the U.S. influence, right? The Bay was Lord & Taylor at the time. Lord & Taylor was, get this thing going. We want to get IPO'd as HBC again. This made a lot of sense for their sort of what they wanted to position as part of it. And then I look at Lowe's at the same time too. When Lowe's came in 2012 and said we wanted to do e-commerce, they weren't the last in the game, but they also were kind of now starting to see the need and the desire. And at that point, the customers were also speaking loud and clear, right? So the feedback you were getting is, why don't you have an e-commerce site? Think about Target when it came to Canada and didn't launch with e-com. What was the first reaction everybody had? It was great. I love these Target stores and great concept.
It was like, wait, what? You don't have what?
But you don't have e-com? You don't have a place where I can see your catalog?
It was just another nick in the, so to speak, in the Target.
So, I think about that evolution, and I think about, all these things that are happening between 2007 and 2012. And really what you start seeing is that e-commerce became a customer shift. And I think customers took sort of control of their desire and said, if you don't have what we want, we'll go to somebody else who has it. So if the idea of Lowe's, we won't go to Lowe's, we'll go to Home Depot. Home Depot's got what it needs. Yeah. So those shifts started happening. And I think companies started realizing those shifts as Amazon kept pushing and pushing and pushing. The dearth was, I don't even need an e-commerce site just to be a profitable e-commerce site. I need an e-commerce site to support my brick and mortar business. And that logic changed.
Yeah, and it felt like it became the intersection of opportunity and risk.
Correct.
Because, when I was first doing HBC, we were excited, we launched, but there wasn't much demand, actually. These were early days, and it was a little hard to pry in the pump. Google really wasn't going. But then it became, okay, so now, and any retailer, Lowe's, whoever, it's got a priority list, right? Do I do better lighting in the store?
Right.
Or do I spend it on e-commerce?
Okay.
And at some point, it did feel like for all of us that started to tip a little bit.
Right, for sure. Because initially those decisions would be like, let's improve the store.
Yeah.
Let's fix the store.
Because we'll see more, legitimately, we'll see more bang for our buck out of that.
And I think part of the challenge for all senior executives is how do you balance those investments so you're not robbing one in order to invest in another, but try to sort of go lockstep and say, we got to do this. Yes, we can't do it all, but we got to do this too. So how do we sort of spread a little bit of that monies, but not in a point where we're just dusting, which is like just trying to sprinkle a little here, sprinkle a little there, where you get no. You can say you're doing stuff, but you're not really making an impact. I think that's what I would sort of argue is that more and more senior leadership started seeing that. I also think one of the other big changes that's happened is you see the advance of like CDO roles or even CMOs taking on the digital sort of stance and becoming more digitally inclined. That's been a big. It's not been talked about a lot, but for me, that's a big part of the change. Is that you now started seeing not digital just being a rounding error in the corner or some like island, which is like if you think about the Bay and you think about Lowe's, which is how we were treated, was leave those guys alone. They're a bunch of guys. We'll stick them in a corner and let them do their work. Was more how do we bring them to the decision rights where they're sitting on the executive table to actually influence the strategy of the company. And for me, that's also what helped kind of change the name of the game. Was you started seeing more of that input and that customer focus, which is really starting on the digital side first, and then ultimately entering in a store second.
It's a really interesting insight. Let's talk about, you mentioned stores, so it's a nice segue to the next question. Let's talk about your experience as you're early leader in merging these two worlds together, which can be messy.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I was talking to my friend Andrew Resnick. We were talking about operations and stores. He goes, oh my God, I still see it in stores today. And it's just starting, where you've got online, the notion of these two things merging together is very seamless at a strategic perspective, but when it hits the ground, what's your experience in the stores as you think about returns and pickup and all that? You've lived through it.
It's been tough. I mean, I think that's the next frontier of where we kind of have to meld these two businesses together and do it in a way that my mom can feel like it's still one business, if I want to say it that way. Sure. Let's look at customer experience of just pickup. Like, we've taken the brick and mortar business and we've kind of created a pickup location at a customer service desk. We've kind of forced it in there. But if you kind of take the step back and you think about customer service, that customer service desk is supporting like the store stuff that happens, customers walking in, it's supporting returns, it's also supporting like the vehicle rental if you need to rent a van to get something out,
lots of stuff,
figuring out deliveries type stuff, or problem solving. And then you gotta get, hey, I'm here to pick up my stuff. And you've also got a 100,000 square foot store that not everything's sort of these small little things that fit in the front of the store for easy pickup.
Or even for that matter, may not even be listed in the store.
Correct.
If from
right. So I think, as I think through like where the next, as we talked about e-commerce, I think everybody will say e-commerce is established and really good, and everybody can understand the transactional value behind it.
You can all get better at it, but
for sure, I think the next frontier for retail is the customer experience of how do you bleed the digital and physical formats together, because that for me is where everything kind of really is going to happen. And you think about, like, I sell products that are not in the store as you described. Well, how does an associate sell that? Do we even equip the associate with the tools to sell that today? Today we don't, right? But that's where we need to get to, where as an associate I can sell you stuff you see and stuff you don't see, and you can walk out of that store feeling like you bought something without feeling like you're leaving empty-handed.
It does. What do you think of I've seen more and more lockers. I mean, you've got some big kiosks. You've got
the Canadian Tire
You've
tower.
got the tire running the tower, which is pretty slick. I order sometimes in that store just to experience it. Little whiz bang.
I've struggled with it. To be honest with you, Mike. Like, it's been one of these things where our stuff doesn't fit correctly always in a locker, and part of where I've also struggled, and I had this experience with Amazon recently. I was out in Orlando and I wanted to buy some stuff from Amazon for the kids, just to make my trip easier when we were out in Florida. And so I chose a locker. And the number, as I had already added everything into my cart and kind of got to the checkout, as I'm finally in that final phase of I want to check out, in the e-commerce world, we would say it'd be sacrilege to have all these things in the cart that just start causing friction. And here's Amazon, which, boasts, the biggest retailer on the planet. And yet now 4 of the 8 items I have in my cart are not eligible to be sent to the locker. And now I don't know which ones are, because the UX is not the greatest, and I'm kind of frustrated by this point.
Marketplace stuff or non-marketplace
exactly,
stuff.
And kind of like, you know what? Forget it. Like, this is not going to work for me. I want out. I'll just go to a local store when I get there and deal with it. So, I think lockers can work. I think a lot of it has to deal with some sort of upfront activity, which I think sometimes gets forgotten about. I know Depot and Lowe's in the U.S. are both trying this stuff, and I know they're struggling with it.
The grocery guys are taking on a pretty tough task too, and refrigerated, frozen,
correct,
and shelf stable stuff.
Yeah,
that's a gnarly thing for them.
It is, and I think part of lockers also is you need to establish delivery times or pickup times, right? So I think that's where groceries, like, you have a window, you got to pick it up in this window. I just ordered something for Mastermind, so tonight I'm going to go to Mastermind Toys, and I only was given 24 hours to pick it up, right? So, I can argue that's a great customer experience or a bad customer experience, given my scheduling and all that type of stuff. But I get why they're trying to do it, is they're trying to get that item off the shelf and into my hands as quickly as possible. And if I don't want it, then put it back on the shelf so the next customer gets it. At Lowe's,
or just not block up.
But at Lowe's, that's a bit harder, right? Because you're in project mode, so you may not need an appliance today. I might be buying that appliance now, but I want it 3 weeks from now, because that's when I'm going to be ready to put those appliances in my kitchen. Or, oh my God, I need it right away. I need delivery like next day. Yeah. Lockers aren't going to help me because I can't stick any of the stuff in the locker.
Yeah, or I just don't want to roll to the store and get it.
Yeah, so all of these things add some complexity, I think, to it. What I look at where I think we need to spend our time is trying to optimize that store experience of when you walk in, not just for the customer side, but also for our associates. Think about how much stuff that we actually, we've put all over our store in a high selling period, like decking. Like, God, I have no space to put that stuff during like May. So now it's getting into the aisles. It's impacting customers. It's impacting associates. Customers are sitting there going, I could just go pick this stuff myself in a shorter time than it would take for you to fill it. Yeah. I think that's where we got to figure out, do we set up dedicated pickup desks? Like Best Buy's tried that.
Yep.
How does that going to work for us? Yep. Do we inherently want to spend the labor to support this? So instead of always trying to like peel labor from different departments and kind of say, let's additively get this labor, do we start dedicating it? But think about the challenge in that even. Like the scheduling of picking, packing, and shipping in a retail format isn't as simple as it is sort of in a DC format. So, we've got a lot of things to think through, but I think there's a lot of innovation in terms of like what's happening, where people are, text me when you're coming into the store. Give me an hour's notice.
Yep.
That could be working for us.
April, welcome to the Voice of Retail. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's great to be speaking to you. First podcast episode of the season, and I couldn't think of a better way to start than kind of delving in with your deep experience into retail and operations and the front line and getting some insights and as retailers as we all think about 2020 and beyond. But let's start with a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your own personal and professional journey and what you do and where you've been and your connection to retail.
Yeah, sure. So I started off in retail a very long time ago, over 25 years ago now. And it was one of those things that happened kind of by default, like many store managers and early, when you go into retail, it's kind of like some people just end up in it as a job because it's something to do when you're younger. And that's kind of what happened to me. I ended up in it by default. It wasn't really a choice. And then just really kind of fell in love with it, the whole people side of it. So I started off on the shop floor back in the UK, and then worked for Gap and Starbucks in the UK when they opened, and then moved over to the US with Starbucks, was a store manager, and then ended up moving to Canada in 2006. And at that time, I was a district manager. So I kind of have worked my way up through every role in sales and operations, and worked for various companies, Apple, Holt Renfrew, Laura Canada, and then the last role that I actually had was the vice president of sales and operations for David's Tea, where I managed all of US, Canada, all the regional directors, and I had training and development. That was the first time I had training and development underneath me, which is a bit unusual for operations, but I'm so passionate about training and development, so I kind of had that under my wings. So I've been doing it a long time, and always working on the shop floor with the frontline employees.
And with a variety of formats, right? The ones you mentioned, you've got everything from, David's Tea, which is a lot of volume versus the different experiences at an Apple or the different formats. So that's a great range of experience. So it really leads me to my next question, which is, as I said at the beginning, it's the start of the whole new year. And from your perspective, what should retailers be thinking about? It's a new year, a new decade. What should retailers, what should be on their minds now as they think about their business and looking forward?
It's a great question. And it's something that I've been pondering a lot over the last couple of weeks and talking to a few different people that I work with, because obviously now I'm in the consulting world. And I think when you think about retail for the next decade, the last decade, we've done a lot of heavy investment in online and omni, and that's really important to make sure all of that online experience is blending with the store experience. And that's been a lot of discussion for the last couple of years. But I think as you think about going forwards, I think that, top three things, I think investing in technology is crucial and important and making it seamless for the customer. But I also think that investing in your people is really crucial. And I think that's taken a bit of a backseat in the last 3 to 4 years as retailers were trying to figure out where to put their money and where to invest it. And unfortunately, the people on the front lines in the stores kind of took a bit of a hit in terms of the investment that we could do for them. So I think that when I started off in retail, it was a big deal. The investment in training, and that's what probably helped me get to where I was in my own retail career because of the investment I had from the companies I worked with at that time. And so I think investing in your people is very important, and I think you can't take that for granted, and you shouldn't take for granted that people are going to stay with you forever if they're not getting what they need. And I think the second piece to that is I think you need to really keep in mind that what are you measuring as your success? I've been in retail for 25 years, and I've been running sales and operations teams, and the success has always been measured on the comp results, which is important. However, I think measuring engagement of your teams in working for you as an organization is going to be a key, crucial component of what drives those results in the future. And I think that needs to come back to the forefront because at the end of the day, your sales teams are working with your customers every day, and they're the ones that are the face of the brand and kind of creating that emotional connection. So I think the third piece is just don't take that for granted. Don't take people for granted, and don't take your customers for granted. Customers want convenience, they want great product, and they want availability. But the employee needs that experience at the same time. So that's why I'm super passionate about training and development, because I think it needs to swing back around. And we know that that's one of the top asks in every exit interview, or even millennials, what they're looking for in the workforce.
You make a bunch of really great points. I want to unpack a couple of them. The interesting point about this investment in e-commerce and omni-channel, and I think that has taken a number of different elements of expense or innovation, because you started to see that become all of the innovation around stores for a couple of years. It's like, we're going to put all our focus on e-commerce, and that was, of course, a pretty heavy lifting. Your point around it being interesting that now you can kind of, okay, we've got e-commerce, we've got the platform, this now what? And when I talk to retailers coast to coast, many of them are thinking, listen, it's harder and harder every day to drive incremental store traffic. So they start to turn their minds to, how do I get the most out of the customers that are in my store? And I think that's where your point about training is, right? So, flat is the new up. I've said then let's focus on the other factor, which is increasing conversion. And is that what you're hearing as well from
that's exactly what I'm hearing. And what I'm hearing is the desire to have more kind of a measurement on net promoter scores with the customer satisfaction. And what I'd like to hear more about is the employee the ENPS, the employee net promoter score, because we know that drives the customer net promoter score, and Apple do that exceptionally well. They have very high standards when it comes to employee net promoter scores, which drives their customer net promoter scores. And it's a huge focus, and it's a huge part of a manager's measurement of success on their annual or quarterly reviews. And so I think that does need to come. I think that needs to be a priority with the leaders that are thinking about how they're going to keep fighting for that space, because it's difficult in the store experience now, and people are stressed, and especially when you're, I was in retail when a time when sales were like double-digit comps, and the same people that were driving those comps there's still some of them that are still around, and they're not feeling as successful. So I think we have to find ways to help them feel successful, so that they can continue to drive the success of that brand with their customers. I was reading a recent article in the New York Times, and they were talking, it was associates, and they were talking in this article about the Gap, and that they used like 5 or 7 different apps. Like the skill level of associates now feels like, that you've got the two pressures. One, you've got customers who are walking in very well versed about the product already. 2, they're kind of distracted because they are looking at their phone or whatever. But it feels like the associates now need more skills and more training than ever before, as opposed to, we've got a savvy customer and they're going to be self-serving. It feels a lot like there's room for investment. Because I don't think that the old style of trying to influence and convince people to buy, it's selling as a skill. But I think the true test of the success in the future is going to be the brand that has people that create those emotional connections and do it genuinely, with empathy, with all of those EQ skills. And I think that's where the focus needs to switch. And again, I think that's why Apple do it well, because they teach that. And I know that because I worked there. So I think that needs to really be in people. People need a people strategy. And they need to have something on that people strategy that is actionable and can be operationalized, and that it's not just a theory that's happening in the background, but it's actually living on the shop floor.
When you talk about that, you talk about like empathy and curiosity can be trained. Is that what I'm hearing?
There's been studies and books about it. I study leadership. I'm like a constant learner of it. And you can, yes, there is people that naturally have these skills, but, they predict like empathy coaches, just like executive or life coaches, being around in the future because it's something that needs to be trained. So, and I think I have a 22-year-old. She had a part-time job in a retail store. So that was great because it gave me like way back when a whole new perspective on how somebody feels about working and onboarding and the training and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes I think when you're 50,000 feet up, because I've been there when I was the VP, you forget what that first time person's job experience is going to be like and how that does transfer to the customer. And it's basic, but it's very important.
What 3 key lessons would you kind of summarize, or observations or lessons, from the shop floor, from your experience? Yeah. And then we're going to talk about Retail U in a second as well, as kind of from the training perspective. But, if you're speaking to retailers today, what are those top 3 things they should be thinking about?
Keep things simple. Operations, operators, field leaders, they want things simple and they want to be able to execute it. And sometimes in the reaction of like the sales promo or the product or something's not working, everybody's trying to figure out what to do. And sometimes that hits the field and it makes it difficult for the field to execute it. Now, I understand you have to react. I know that because I ran sales teams and I understand that. But I think you have to really think about the end user, because that person on the shop floor can only, some people are only working 2 8-hour shifts a week. So you have to think about that and think about everything that you're doing and every strategy you're putting in place, that they're able to communicate what you're asking them to the customer. And that's why there's great communication tools out there that you can use to do that. But just even zooming out of the communication tools, just keeping things really simple. And, I always say when I used to visit 250 stores, and I remember this clearly after 3 days of doing, 15 stores back to back, store visits, you hear the same thing. Mm-hmm. It might be slightly different, but you do hear the same thing when you're asking people, what can we do to help you? What can we do to improve sales? What are your customers asking you for? So I think lessons from the shop floor is listen to the people that work on the shop floor with your customers, whether you do a customer insight survey, maybe you don't have one today, but maybe that's something that you want to prioritize. Or find a way to gather that feedback from the frontline employees, because that can help you guide decisions, and not sit in an office and kind of think, what are we going to do, when it's all really, I think the answers to a lot of questions are in the field. So I think that's important to keep that in mind. And then remove the obstacles and the barriers that stop them from being able to help the customers. There's a lot of times that, processes are put in place or for good intentions. Everybody's always got the best intentions and everybody's working for the same cause. But I think you have to really think through anything that you're implementing and removing those obstacles and barriers to make it easy for your shop floor employees to be able to execute. The new world of retail is convenience and ease, and it has to be the same thing for the people working on the shop floor with the customers.
Well, you mentioned briefly as you were talking about your personal journey that you're an entrepreneur now. So let's talk about Retail U.
I started about 3 years ago, and it's turned into an amazing library of e-learning. It makes leadership development and skill building courses for retail. And we started off with just thinking with operations in mind, but it's now expanding to other areas of the business. For example, we have an amazing leader of loss prevention who's creating a course. We have somebody that was a senior buyer that's making a course to how to be a buyer in retail. But the core of it is all leadership development, core competency building, skill building courses. And they're made so easy to use because they're literally like 4-minute videos, super affordable. The pricing, I think, people sometimes say to me, do you think it's too cheap? And I'm like, no, I think I want to make it available and accessible for all retailers. So that's our mission, is to make it value in the price, but also value adding to you as a business. And it's created by people that have done the job, not by a technology company that's creating content for you, but by people that have actually worked, in the trenches in those roles. And so it's those years of experience that you can't, you gain so much from putting that into the content, because it's the experience that's going to help other people coming up and building those skills. So it has a community on it, like a social function, which is awesome because you can talk to, and there's people on that now from all over the world, all different retailers, quizzes, certificates, we can customize for retailers. So it really came from the idea of just making, training and development accessible and affordable for retailers globally. Yeah.
Well, how can people or listeners learn more and get in touch with you directly?
You can email us at info@retailu.ca if you want to find out more information about it, and you can get in touch with us, and one of our team members would love to walk you through it and share more about how we can add value to you and your people.
Well, thanks for sharing. Thanks for coming on the podcast, April. It's a real treat to talk to you again. You and I have known each other for several years, and I congratulate you on your success and wish you nothing but the best, and look forward to catching up with you a little later in the year and see how 2020 is going for you and for retailers on the shop floor. Thanks to Tanbir and April for being my guests in this special episode. Sorry for the small technical issues I had with April's interview towards the end. The software seemed to merge our voices together. We weren't talking over each other, but it sounded like that towards the end. Well, let's hit the highlights for what happened in retail this week, actually the past couple of weeks. First of all, starting off with some sad news with the passing of Jeremy Reitman, the champion of Canadians' fashion industry, who leaves behind a strong ship. There are comments there in the article from the National Post as well. Deanne Brisebois talks about, from Retail Council of Canada, Jeremy's focused on his business, the growth of his business. Reitman leaves a rich legacy as a champion of Montreal's fashion industry. So sad news in the passing of Jeremy Reitman. Next, we have the mall that Christmas forgot. So this from the Globe and Mail. A Calgary mall, $200 million mall that was built up, and it was kind of like a bazaar style with several units. I mean, on paper, sometimes these things sound good. It's not, in some ways, not unlike what we see in Toronto. There's the container market, which is downtown near Front Street. It seems to work where small retailers can share a common little spaces that's built up, stacked, that's called. But it didn't work here. 80% of the shop spaces are empty. Shopkeepers don't even bother keeping regular hours. There's $200 million. So is this format the future of department store, the future of malls? Probably not, by the looks of things. Lots of ideas vying for that. Whether it's a walk through Hudson Yards or whether it's a walk through Showfields, lots of different ideas for what the future holds. December 23rd, biggest sales day of the year for some retailers. A quote here from London Drugs' Clint Mauman, and this from Business in Vancouver. So I guess probably the 23rd was the biggest day. I mean, when you combine last-minute gift giving, that was the Saturday, last-minute gift giving, food buying, all those things seem to come together. There's some kind of couple of perspectives on which was the biggest day. Moneris was out talking about Friday being a bigger day than the Saturday, but in any event, they were all big days. From Globe and Mail for subscribers, 2019 review from Rihanna's lingerie line to Aldo's smart shoe boxes. Fashion, beauty, and retail became more inclusive and sustainable. We're going to be talking about it a lot on this. We talked a lot about it in sustainability, retail sustainability in 2019, and I can't imagine it's going to decrease for 2020. I imagine for all of us and for the industry, we'll be talking and continue to talk a lot more about sustainability. So good article here from the Globe and Mail. From CTV News, Coalition of Manitoba Businesses look for action against retail theft. So great John Graham, our Director of Government Relations for in the Prairies, is helping pull together this organization with a number of different associations together, representing all kinds of different elements of business to help retailers in Manitoba deal with a real uptick in retail theft and deal with that together, work collaboratively need some special care to get that under control. Speaking of Winnipeg, Boxing Day is still important for Winnipeg retailers. This from the Winnipeg Sun. This actually, I had the opportunity to speak with the reporter and interviewed here. I just talk about how Boxing Day is still very, very important. 34% of Canadians in our study, Retail Council of Canada study, talked about that being a day that they would shop on or a period they would shop on. So 34% of Canadians agreeing to do anything on any one given time is major. It's not going away. It's a little less intense, perhaps, than it used to be given Black Friday, Cyber Monday. And that's the gist of the article. What else we got? Retail around the world. Welcome to the era of the post-shopping mall. We're going to be talking a lot about shopping malls in the next couple of weeks, whether it's this mall in Calgary, whether it's article here, New York Times, from the American Dream. And next week, we'll be talking about the Retail Council of Canada Shopping Mall Survey for 2019, Shopping Mall Study for 2019. So look forward to that. We'll be chatting about that next week. And this article is really interesting. The destination that American Dream is. So it's a good article. Now, conversely, heading over to Europe, they're having a real hard time, particularly in London, in England. High street emergency as 61 shops close in one day and 140,000 jobs axed in retail crisis. Listen, retailers in London and England have not had an easy time with it, given all the uncertainty around Brexit. It's really transforming retail over there, not in a great way in the short term. So we'll see. We wish them all the best, but tough days over in England. Online brands hope to score surprising success with brick and mortar shops. Not really that surprising, actually. I put this in because it's an interesting article from New York Post, and it covered a number of different concepts. So it's worth reading. But no one who's listening to this podcast, or certainly who has listened to the podcast, would find that a surprise, where online brands are succeeding in brick and mortar. I think 80%, 90% of all digital-first, digital-native brands have stores now. Michael shares 32% increase after the company names Walmart executive as new CEO. So Michael's, good luck to them. New talent coming in from Walmart, and apparently the market likes it. 32% increase in their share price proves it that way. Let's see. That's high standards to live up to. So we wish them all the best. Shift happens. 7 factors that define a decade of retail disruption. This is from Forbes and our friend Steve Dennis, who talks about all the kind of key elements that have really shifted retail. Great summary article. And I'll be talking with Steve in New York in about a week, actually, a week and a half at NRF Big Show. I'll be there podcasting from the NRF podcasting studio, interviewing lots of interesting people. So keep your ears open for upcoming episodes where I'll be talking and chitting and chatting to all kinds of interesting people in New York around the NRF Big Show. Stopping power, the new way to an immersive shopping experience. Actually, this is from Samsung, kind of a great article here. And again, this is all being taken to Retail This Week, which is a weekly newsletter that I compile for Retail Council of Canada, and comes out each and every week. You should sign up. It's a great newsletter that kind of captures if some things you may have heard of, some things you may not have. So something to pay attention to there. In terms of indies, article here on I linked to from Canadian Retailer celebrating Mark Startup and his transition to a new phase as he's celebrating his lifetime in retail and supporting small business retail. So we wish Mark all the best. I did a podcast episode from Vancouver with Mark, so have a listen to that a couple of episodes ago, as he shares his insights from as it says, 37 years of service to retailers. So tons of insight, and what a fantastic contribution. Clothing retailers seizing secondhand opportunity. I put this in indie section because a lot of indies are looking at this. That's in some ways not new, but the real, this zeitgeist of secondhand opportunities, secondhand stores is really taking hold. And of course, we've talked about on the podcast before that, some forecast, admittedly, from the people who would benefit most, talking about how it's going to be bigger than fast fashion. We'll see how it all sorts out, but certainly I think 2020 will be a very interesting year in terms of, again, sustainability, and you wrap this in sustainability, it's certainly a big trend not to be ignored. Good article here. These cannabis hopefuls bled money waiting for Ontario to change its tune on retail. It's a summary article. I pulled this from the Ottawa Citizen. It's really telling. They did an interview here with Abby Roach, from Hotbox Cafe, from Kensington Market. A real pioneer. But Ontario's move to switch to the lottery systems cost her about $250,000 between what they had invested, getting ready, and then just not being able to sell. And so there's many stories in this article about the costs, the real costs of the Ontario flip-flop from open market to lottery. We're happy, of course, that they've reopened the market this year, starting, I guess, in April, with new stores at 250 new store licenses. So that's great progress, but would have been good to have that in the back half of last year. But let's see how it rolls out for the rest of the year, 2020. Also up in digital, I've got this article from New York Times. I mentioned it in just now in my interview with April. Her job requires 7 apps. She works retail, responding to customers' demands for instant gratification in the middle of the retail apocalypse. So can't say I love that title. As you know, there is no retail apocalypse. This is from New York Times. But it is a good article, notwithstanding the not so great or accurate headline about how associates on the floor have to manage so many more apps and so much more technology. And we talked about that if you were listening to the interview with April. I was also, finally, there's a good article from Payments, which is 2020 trend lines. Now, it's an American-oriented article around payments, but it is still a good article from an overview perspective of what to expect in 2020. As you know, as listeners will likely know, payments in Canada is actually ahead in many ways of where it is in the U.S. market, just given the nature of the marketplace. But it's an interesting article nonetheless, as a survey overview and article. Well, all right. Well, that's a wrap on this edition of The Voice of Retail. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple iTunes, your favorite podcast platform. Please rate and review. Be sure and recommend to a friend or colleague in the retail industry. I'm Michael LeBlanc, founder and president of Emmy LeBlanc Company, Inc. You can learn more about me on www.emmyleblanc.co or, of course, on LinkedIn. Until next time, have a great week.